Several years ago, I was challenged to read the Bible in 2 months or 3 months, and then I found myself trying to skip the chapters relating to the tabernacle. There were almost 37 chapters of the tabernacle, and it made such dull reading that I would try and skip them. But then I began to wonder why we had so much description of the tabernacle, and that led me to reflecting on the meaning of the tabernacle, and this is what I'm going to present this morning. The first lesson I learned was that worship should be a revelation. Worship, religion, spirituality, all that needs to be a revelation. It should not be man's invention. And then I learned about how God was able to provide for even gold and silver in the wilderness in spite of the challenges. And the tabernacle was a wonderful teaching tool, a pedagogic tool, where people, without going to a Bible school or without going to catechism classes, they would learn a lot. And then how it instilled a sense of beauty into sort of people who were slaves for 300 years. And how worship was central to life and orderliness. I will tell you about that. And then how it developed community, and how developing community is so very important, and how tabernacle was a transformational tool. And finally, it connected the Old Testament and the New Testament. A lot of us have problems with the Old Testament God. We think of the Old Testament God as a very angry God, and we like the New Testament God. But this tabernacle story helps us to connect the two and help us to understand that it is actually one and the same. First lesson was that worship and spirituality should be a revelation. Because what God told Moses on the mountain was, see to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. He did not want Moses to do anything different. Because revelation is central to what we believe. When you leave it to man's imagination, men invent gods that are convenient. They invent gods that will match with their own desire and with their own worldview. And it's prone to severe corruption. And so the practice of worship is prescribed. The other place where there was prescription, detailed prescription given, was building the Noah's Ark. Because Noah's Ark also was a salvific process. You know, it saved people, saved the family from destruction. And so God prescribed exactly the dimensions and the details about building the ark. So also, God prescribed the tabernacle in great detail so that we do it according to, we understand that worship is actually needs to be a revelation. You know, when we think of idolatry, we think of an idol. But if we look at 1 Kings 18:27, Baal worship, when Elijah was challenging the worshippers of Baal, there was no idol. An idea can be an idol, a philosophy can be an idol, atheism is a kind of an idol. And so anything that is different from God prescribed worship and spirituality is an idol. And that is the way to understand idolatry. And why does God want us not to be idolatrous? And the reason is this. Unreal idol creates an unreal worldview, and man loses touch with reality. For example, man is the governor of creation. He is a leader. He needs to harness the earth. And we don't, but most people don't think of human beings as governors or CEOs of creation. They think of themselves as just another animal. And when they have that sort of worldview, they don't have the leadership quality needed to harness and to prosper and to acquire knowledge. In Psalm it says, "They that make them are like unto them, so is everyone that trusted in them." What happens is man gets degraded. God wanted us to be his co-laborers. He wants us to be his co-heirs with Christ. And he wants us to be leaders of the creation, taking charge and taking responsibility. But when you worship idols, that does not happen. So what happens? Now, I'll just give you an example. In the Corruption Perception Index, which is a NGO based in Germany that measures corruption all over the world in all the areas of life, in politics, in policing, in journalism, in business and everything. So the 20 most non-corrupt countries happen to be Protestant countries. Why is it that year after year, Protestant countries head the Corruption Perception Index? And there needs to be a good reason why. And as Christianity is fading from the West, you can see how they are going below on the ranking. And so there is a definite relationship between a Christian worldview and corruption. And then again, in science, there is a relationship between Christian worldview and scientific development. Like out of 1,000 Nobel Prizes, 850 or even more prizes have gone to Judeo-Christian countries, Jews and Christians. And some of the people, if they've got a Nobel Prize, they've got it like for Peace Prize or something like that, like Malala who got. So the Christian worldview has something to do with scientific development. And then the other lesson I wanted us to learn was that God provided in a really wonderful way. For example, 2,200 pounds of gold was required for this building the tabernacle. So many 7,500 pounds of silver, 5,000 pounds of brass, all this was required to build the tabernacle. Besides that, clothing and colors and all those things were required. But just as God was talking to Moses about the tabernacle and telling him that you must cover this with gold and this has to be made of silver and this has to be made of brass, the same time, Aaron in the valley, he was telling people, give me your gold and I will make a golden calf. So you can see how the devil was acting at the same time. And this was actually a lesson to me because we have a problem today in our country. Close to 4,000 Christian organizations have lost their FCRA. Their ability to serve has been taken away. Even organizations that have been helping orphan children, all their FCRAs have been closed. But God has been opening another way for them. social, what is it called, corporate social responsibility. Because of that, they are getting as much money as they were getting through the FCRA. So God is able to provide for His work, even though there can be people who take away from it. And then the tabernacle was a wonderful teaching tool. You know, remember, we are dealing with 5 million slaves. And how do you educate 5 million slaves? And the best way of teaching, people have learned, is through metaphors and through symbolism, not actually words. And so there were lots of symbols. Lamb without blemish and spot. When children go to the tabernacle, they will ask, why Daddy, why should we always take a lamb without blemish and spot? And then as the prophets prophesied, they would begin to learn, yes, we are expecting a Savior who would be absolutely holy, who would give himself as a living sacrifice. And then they will ask about the curtain, about the ark and the high priest and the menorah and all these things. And people will have to explain these things to the children. And so the whole community begins to learn important principles about God. This is the lamb without blemish. The curtain, we know that the curtain tore into two when Jesus was crucified. And sometimes you can say, okay, well, there was too much breeze and the breeze can tear any curtain. But this curtain was 4-layer thick. And it also had one layer was made of animal skin. So, you know, it was not something you could even tear with your hands. It would be very difficult to tear even with the scissors because it was really tough. Now, this tearing of the curtain would have been a great symbolism for the people who knew about what was happening during the time of the crucifixion. This is a rough outline of the tabernacle. First, there was the entrance here, which is the eastern gate. And then there was a brazen altar for burnt offerings, where the priest would burn the offerings. And then there was a brazen laver. There were actually 10 lavers, brazen lavers, where the high priest had to keep on washing the sacrifice and they had to wash themselves. And this is called the courtyard, where everyone could come, including non-Jews. You know, they could come. But then this was the entrance, and this is the holy place, and this is the most holy place. The ark was the only structure in the most holy place, and this is the holy place. Just again, the courtyard was a wonderful place for people to meet and to chat and to develop community. The tabernacle itself was, I told you, divided into two, outer court and the inner court, and the inner court was divided into the holy place and the most holy place. Now, this is the holy place. It had three things: altar of incense, and incense used to go up 24/7 as a worship to God. And the high priest had to make sure that it was always functional. And then this was the table of shewbread, and I will tell you a detail about that, which is very interesting, where there was bread kept for the priests. And then this was the menorah, or the lampstand, with the 7 branches. Now this is the showbread. Now the showbread, I will only tell you the interesting parts about it. It was made up of fully wood, acacia wood, and fully gold. It was not made up of half wood and half gold. What is the meaning of that? That means it symbolizes Jesus, the bread of life, who was fully man, the wood, and fully gold, he was God. And so the showbread symbolizes the bread of life, who was Jesus. And he provided the food for the world. Yes, I already told you this. There were 12 loaves on it. Each loaf was more than a pound, so it would have been enough for the priests who are serving there. And then this is the most important part. This is the Ark of God. Now, it has got two parts, the bottom part, and then there is the lid. You know, this is the Ark, made up of, again, fully gold and fully wood. And this is the mercy seat. The mercy seat is made up of fully gold. It is not made up of, there is no wood in it. So this represents Jesus, and inside it are 10 commandments, and there is Aaron's rod, symbolizing the priest. So the ark is representing of Jesus because it's made up of fully gold and fully wood, and the mercy seat is made up of fully gold, and it is covered with 2 cherubims. If you look at the scriptures and the Psalms, there are many references to this. It says, God who resides above the cherubim, God who sits between the cherubims. So, mercy seat is really the throne of God. It is extraordinary that the God of heaven and earth would want to travel with 5 million slaves and want to be carried from place to place. Why would he want that? Because he wanted people to know that he enjoys man's fellowship. But there were restrictions because he was holy. None of them could actually come in except the high priest once a year. I'll tell you more. It could not be touched, and therefore they had rings. You know, there were rings and wooden poles were put in it. When they carried the ark, they could touch the wood, but they could not touch the gold. And if they touched the gold, they would fall dead. And Uzziah did. Actually, when God was telling Bezalel to make the ark, he said, first you make the ark. That was the first thing. And the most important feature is described first of all because it is the symbol of the approach to God. Everything is peripheral. The most important thing is the ark and the mercy seat. Once a year, during the festival of Yom Kippur, the high priest had to wash himself 7 times. He had to put on new garments, and then he had to confess all his sin, and then he would be able to go and sprinkle blood on the mercy seat 7 times. And that was the only thing that happened in the Holy of Holies. Now remember, there was no furniture in the Holy of Holies. There was no light in the Holy of Holies because God himself was the light. And so menorah was not required. Now, remember, the covering of the ark was called the mercy seat, it was not called the judgment seat. Because God was primarily a God of mercy. He wanted to dwell with men because he knew they would sin and they would need forgiveness. And so the primary name given to the lid of the ark was the mercy seat. That is what the throne was known as. You know, what would kings call their throne? They would call the throne as the throne of power or throne of judgment. But our God wanted to call his throne the mercy seat. And that tells us something about his relationship to us. And the mercy seat was open. There was no covering there. There was no way of limiting God. So there was no sort of an enclosure on the mercy seat. Now the lampstand was made up of pure gold, and there was oil had to be put in and day out, 24/7, so that it kept shining. Now it represents two things. It represents God as the light of the world. Jesus said, "I am the light of the world." So it represents Jesus. But it also represents us because we are also the light of the world. You know, some commentators, they will say, God is like the sun, we are like the moon. We don't really have any light. God shines his light through the moon. But that is not really correct, because God himself resides in us. Emmanuel, that means we have the Spirit of God living inside us. And because of that, we ourselves are little lights. And like God is the light of the world, we are also lights of the world. And because of this, we have this great privilege, but also the great responsibility to shine in a way so that people will glorify God. This is the high priest. He could go in only once a year. So man could have fellowship with God through the high priest. And then another important principle that we learn from the tabernacle is that it was the guiding force. It had the fire by night and a cloud by day. So the guidance was not given in some other way. The guidance was given through the tabernacle. Now, what does that mean? It means that it is God who is resident in us, today the tabernacle is in our own hearts. So the tabernacle in our hearts is someone who should be guiding us. The guiding doesn't happen through military leaders or through Moses. The guidance comes through the tabernacle. And then community worship. You know, there are many religions. There are only 3 religions that have community worship. The Judeo-Christian, the Abrahamic religions. The other religions, they are beginning to, I think, copy, but a lot of the other religions, you know, you just go into a temple, ring the bell, take a prasad, then go off on your way. You can go anytime you want. There was no particular timing. So there was no opportunity to build community. And when you develop community, that does something extremely remarkable. For example, there was a book called Social Capital, written by a Japanese economist called Francis Fukuyama. He said, the amount of social capital determines the wealth of a nation. That means the more social capital there is, the more wealthy the country becomes. Isn't that extraordinary? You would think that a country which has lots of gold and oil would become the richest country in the world, but it's not so. It's countries which have social capital. That means a cohesive community that is willing to work together and support each other. Now, then they began to measure social capital. He got a Nobel Prize for that. So they began to measure social capital, and they found that the highest social capital was developed through the church communities. So it was the church community, you know, in olden days, there used to be church bells in the morning and evening and on Wednesdays, and there used to be different kinds of prayer, men's fellowship and women's fellowship, and they used to keep meeting. And because of that, there was strong community feelings among the Christian nations. And this strong social capital that they developed produced a lot of wealth, because when you work together, you trust each other. And when you trust each other, you're willing to invest money in, you know, XYZ person that you trust. If you don't trust people, like in India and in China, we are low trust societies. They measured the social capital in India and China, and it is low. In low trust societies, I will not trust XYZ and give my money to him because, you know, don't know what he will do. But I will only trust my brother or my sister or cousin brother or someone who is a relative. So in India and China, family businesses thrived, but in the Western countries, corporations thrived. And so I'm just telling you this because of the importance of community and the importance of social capital and how meeting together produces community. One problem about Zoom meetings is that I suspect it does not produce as much community as meeting face to face. And that is why Paul says, don't give up meeting together. It is very important. You can't have church services on television. You cannot have drive-in. You know, there are churches where there is drive-in worship. You have, I've gone to a church like that in California. You drive in your car and there's a big television screen. All the cars are parked there and there are many screens. All of them watch the television screen and the church service is over. You don't meet anybody. But that will not produce social capital. I've already talked to you about this, worshipping together and shared value. Training in beauty. Now remember, God was talking to 5 million slaves who were barely, what shall I say, toilet trained. They had no culture, they had no civilization, and you had to teach them, you know, a culture and order and all that. And so he does that through the tabernacle. First, one example, blue, purple, and red, or scarlet. According to the color theory, if you have colors on the same side of the color spectrum, you know, colors have frequencies, same side of the color spectrum, then they will be matching. But if you have colors in the opposite side of the spectrum, then it will be clashing. And so we find that the colors God chose were all matching colors. So you can see how God had an eye for beauty and he wanted people to learn to understand beauty. And then the labor, it was an intricate work of metallurgy. You know, it had small engravings at the bottom and at the sides. And God gave wisdom to Bezalel and all his workers to make many of these labor, it's called labors, which are for washing. And so there were 20 of them, and each of them was a work of art. And even the ark itself was a great work of art. So you can see how in the middle of a desert, you suddenly have a great beautiful structure full of colors, matching colors, and gold and silver, full of handiwork. And it would create in them a desire for beauty. And God says, my Shekinah glory is over the tabernacle. So the glory of God is in the tabernacle. So what is this glory? I mean, no one can really define that word, but one particular author, he said, the way to define beauty, he used Plato's transcendental. See, what he meant was, he said, Plato said, anything that is very beautiful, truly, truly beautiful, will be really true. And anything that is really, really true will be good. And anything that is truly, truly good will be beautiful. So this author says, these three things are found in the tabernacle. The goodness, because it is about mercy and forgiveness, and beauty, like I've already told you, and truth, because this is exactly what happened after the coming of Jesus. So the three things come together and form the Shekinah glory. And another important principle is the centrality of worship. Now, if you look at how the people were organized, in the middle was the tabernacle. And then around it were the different groups of Levites who had to do different kinds of things. And then each of the tribe they were told their correct places. And so they had to move in this particular order. Every 4 years, India has the Kumbh Mela. Kumbh Mela is held in Allahabad and in Varanasi and sometimes in Nasik. And every Kumbh Mela, there is a stampede and hundreds of people will die. Because there is no order, there is no discipline and in their worship. But God wanted to teach these slaves order and beauty. And so he wanted them to be well organized. So when they move, they would move in this way as a formation. And when they settle, they will also settle in this way. And from the center, there would be the light, which would give light to the whole community. And so you can see how God taught them orderliness and he taught them beauty. Finally, God wanted to live with us. Now, this is the most difficult part for us to understand, because we think of ourselves as just ordinary human beings. Why would the God of heaven and earth want to live with the slaves? And why would he want to make his residence in our own hearts? And this is a very humbling message, but also a very encouraging message that God himself has made his residence in our own hearts. That will tell you something about yourself. And any of us who suffer from a low self-image, you have to remind yourself, it doesn't really depend on how you look or your skills or your abilities or your income. The fact is that God lives in you, and that itself is enough. And finally, this tabernacle planting transformed this group into one of the most powerful nations in the Middle East. And today, we say church planting is a powerful way of transforming societies. Now, I have been involved in Christian work from 1969, and I have seen villages where there was nothing, where churches were planted. Now, after 45 years, I have visited them, and they are thriving with schools and people who are very learned, and there is a lot of prosperity. So church planting, tabernacle planting are very powerful transformational tools. So this is the summary of what I've told you. I'll just close this with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you that you are a wonderful God and that you have made your tabernacle in our own hearts. And we pray that you would continue to live in us, guide us, give us wisdom and understanding so that we might continue to serve you and to love you. Father, we ask in Jesus' precious name.